welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to cover the disappearances of 11-year-old Patrick Warren and 13-year-old David Spencer in Solihull near Birmingham in 1996. The boys' disappearances were not only very suspicious, but in the years following there has been speculation and criticism that the disappearance of two children was not treated as seriously as it should have been. The boys later became known as the Milk Carton Kids. However, the awful fact is what happened to them is still a mystery. This episode is about the disappearance of children and may contain descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Chelmsley Wood is quite a large housing estate located in the metropolitan borough of Solihull in the West Midlands. It's around 8 miles from Birmingham city centre and 5 miles north of Solihull town centre. Chelmsley Wood was created in response to the need for housing after aerial bombing during the Second World War in the area of Birmingham and Solihull destroyed over 12,000 homes. During the 1950s, there became an increased need for housing as the population grew. In 1966, the area of ancient woodland at Chelmsley Wood was purchased, and over 15,000 homes were built there, along with shops, schools, and other amenities. This was to home some of the families that were on the council house waiting list and did help to ease the housing problem that the area was suffering from. It's reported that during the 1970s the area struggled with some antisocial behaviour and crime issues, mainly due to the rising unemployment crisis that the country as a whole was facing. In later years, the area has been undergoing development, with some of the tower blocks being removed and replaced with houses. Chelmsley Wood is where 11-year-old Patrick Warren and 13-year-old David Spencer lived in 1996. Both children lived at home with their parents and siblings. Patrick, known as Paddy, was from a particularly large family, one of 7 other siblings. The boys were good friends and were often seen together, playing out and at each other's houses. In a BBC article, both Bridget, Paddy's mum, and Christine, David's mum, described the boys. As Bridget is Irish, she explained that Paddy would often make fun of her accent when she lost her temper. She stated, "He was a bit on the wild side. There's no point in saying he was an angel because he wasn't. I would say he was cheeky, but other kids' mothers used to say Paddy is a terrific little lad. Even his teachers said he was a good lad." David enjoyed boxing and was described by his brother as being an outgoing person who looked out for his siblings. Christine, David's mother, told the BBC, "He didn't like discipline. You couldn't tell him what to do. He was aggressive. If someone caused him grief, he took the law into his own hands and used force to keep them off his back, which was unacceptable." David's behaviour had got him into trouble as he grew to be a teenager, and this had led to him being excluded at age 12. He was described by his school as bright but unpredictable. As was a common pastime during the 1990s, the boys often spent time in the neighbourhood together, visiting friends and playing games. This is exactly what they were doing on Boxing Day of 1996. It was a cold December and ice had covered some areas. David and Patrick had decided to spend the day playing out and travelling around the neighbourhood. Patrick was particularly excited to show off his new Christmas present, a red Apollo laser bike that he had received the previous day. He wanted to give it a test drive around, and so he rode it round the neighbourhood with David walking by his side. It's not clear what the boys did during the day, however it was later discovered that they had been spotted by a police officer earlier on, along with a group of the boys' friends. They caught the officer's attention as the group of children were playing by an area called Meridian Lake. The lake was frozen at the time, and the officer had warned the children not to play on there as it could be dangerous. The children left the lake at that point. David and Patrick spent all day in the neighbourhood, and it's reported that they were still out as late as midnight. It was at this point that David returned to his home and told his mum that he and Patrick were going to spend the night at Patrick's brother's house, which was just a short walk away from his home. It was known that the boys then headed back out, however they did not go directly to Patrick's brother's house as they said. An attendant at a petrol station just down the hill from the boys' houses reported that they had come to the station and asked for a packet of biscuits before heading over in the direction of the nearby shopping centre. The attendant stated that it was around 12:45 at that point when the boys walked off. This sadly would be the last sighting of the boys that would be reported. The next morning neither Patrick nor David had returned home, and both families decided to check where they might be. They soon discovered that they were not at Patrick's brother's house and continued to check the neighbourhood for any sign of them. This, however, proved fruitless, with the families unable to find them. This was a concern, as even though they did spend time away from home and stay out until late, they had never not returned home. This was out of character. The families decided that they needed to phone the police, and on the 27th of December they notified West Midlands police that they were missing. Officers came out to begin investigations into the report of the missing boys, and initially spoke to the families and knocked on doors in the area to establish if any of the neighbours had seen the boys, either that day or the night before. Officers also searched the local areas and the places that David and Patrick were known to play. The boys were not located at any of these usual spots, and this only caused their families further worry. It was hoped that they were just out and about and had simply decided not to return home. This was looking less and less likely. It was soon discovered that there had been a confirmed sighting of the boys in the early hours of the morning at the petrol station. Detectives were told by the attendant that the boys had been at the station and had asked for a packet of biscuits. This provided police with an indication of when the boys had last been seen, but unfortunately it was clear from their interviews with the local community that they had not been seen since. The search and the questioning of neighbours and friends drew the attention of the media, and it was soon apparent that the boys were missing. The fact that they had disappeared in the early hours of the morning increased the public's concern about the boys' safety. Police did speak to the media not long after the investigation had begun into their disappearances. Detectives explained that they were treating Patrick and David's disappearances as a missing person inquiry and that they were currently searching the local area. The boys were described by the police as streetwise and that they believed that they could be playing a game or were simply staying out with friends. The police stated that they hoped they would soon be found and that they did not at that time believe they had come to any harm. They offered a £500 reward for anyone that may have information or who may actually be with them. For some, however, including the boys' family, the idea that they were simply hiding did not make sense. They were only 11 and 13 years old. Children could not be as streetwise as adults and could not make the same logical choices. The investigation continued, however, with the police treating the case solely as a missing person inquiry. The lack of confirmed sightings and the limited amount of evidence of where the boys could be caused people to wonder what had really happened to them. How had two children simply vanished from the neighbourhood? Soon after the boys were reported missing, a discovery was made that narrowed down their timeline significantly. When the neighbourhood was searched for any evidence pointing to the boys' whereabouts, a bike was found at the back of the petrol station where they had last been seen. A red Apollo laser bicycle had been discovered hidden behind some bins at the back of the station. This bike clearly matched the description of the one that Patrick had been riding the night that he had gone missing. However, it was not immediately connected with the boys' disappearances. It was eventually later identified as belonging to Patrick. The fact that it was not immediately linked to the missing boys has been something that has been pointed out as a mistake in the case, particularly as that was also the location of the last sighting. This discovery raised a number of questions and some red flags. Patrick had been proud of his new bike and wanted to show it off that Boxing Day. Why would he have left it behind the bins and not returned to get it? The fact that it appeared to have been hidden was also a concern. Would the boys have hidden the bike in that way? After this discovery, it was clear that either the boys had not moved far from the location where they had last been seen, or they had travelled somewhere on foot, leaving the bike behind. The disappearance of 2 children from a residential neighbourhood caught the attention of the public, and the boys' families found themselves at the centre of an investigation and media speculation. The question of why the boys had been allowed out at midnight and early hours of the morning was something that the police were interested in, and they started to look into the families of Patrick and David. It's reported that a full forensic investigation took place at both families' houses to try and establish if they had anything to do with the disappearances. Following on from these investigations, it was stated that nothing untoward was found, and that there was nothing that suggested foul play had occurred in the homes. In January 1997, Patrick's mum Bridget and David's mum Christine made an appeal along with the police to urge their sons to come home. Both mums explained how worried they were about their safety and asked that they get in touch. Detectives made multiple appeals in local newspapers discussing how important it was that the boys came home and asking anyone with information to come forward to help in their inquiry. As the days and weeks passed with no sign of either of the boys, hope that they would be found was slowly diminishing, and the families were feeling increasingly desperate for information. Detectives made checks on the sex offenders' registers and tracked down known paedophiles who were living in the area. It's reported that these offenders were tracked down and questioned about their whereabouts that evening, however this did not lead to any new information in the case. They were ruled out as having anything to do with the disappearances. 1996 turned into 1997, and the boys were still missing. In February 1997, searches were made of a nearby lake, and local mine shafts were also checked to see if the boys had got into some sort of accident, and they had ended up submerged or trapped. Once again, this search did not locate the boys, or any evidence that could be connected to them. It was at this point in the investigation, 3 months after David and Patrick's disappearances, that officers from the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, were brought in to assist. It was evident that after such a long time had elapsed, the boys were not simply hiding from their parents. There was a large possibility that something had happened to them. The one thing that definitely stood out during the investigation was that both boys had gone missing together, and the likelihood of this happening if they had got into an accident, for instance, seemed slim. The case, while gaining local attention, had failed to make it into many of the national headlines. In April 1997, it was decided that the boys would be featured on the side of 4-pint milk cartons that were sold in Iceland supermarkets. This was part of a campaign that was being ran by the National Missing Persons Helpline. This had been a strategy implemented in the United States, most famously with the first child being featured, Ethan Patz. Ethan was 6 in 1979 when his mum had let him get on the bus to school in Soho, Manhattan. He didn't arrive at school, and his parents began fighting for people to hear about his case. One of the ways that they did this was to put Ethan's face on milk cartons. He and other missing children were also featured on the sides of buses and other public areas. Ethan's mother said in 1985, "If it makes people feel uncomfortable, that's terrific." Ethan was the first child to feature on the sides of milk cartons, and many other missing children have featured since. In the UK, this strategy had not been tried and implemented. However, in 1997, Patrick and David's faces were featured in 770 Iceland stores nationwide. It was hoped that this exposure would bring new leads and information. Sadly, this was not what happened, and the campaign did not actually lead to progress in the investigation. The time was ticking by, and it was clear that despite the narrative in the media that the boys were runaways, this probably was not what had happened to them. Months turned into years, and in 1999 a development occurred that at first glance appeared completely unrelated to the boys' cases. In 1999, a man named Brian Field was arrested on a drink-driving charge in Chelmsley Wood. A routine DNA swab was taken after this arrest, and when this DNA was put into the system, a surprise connection was made. His DNA matched a sample that had been taken from the trousers of a murder victim, 14-year-old Roy Tutil. Roy lived in Surrey in 1968 and was on his way home from Kingston Grammar School. He got on the bus with his friends but got off before he arrived home. It's reported that he was saving money to buy a new bike and often got off the bus early and hitchhiked the rest of the way. His body was found 3 days later, and it was found that he had been sexually assaulted and murdered. What had happened to Roy was a mystery and was unsolved for many years, with a partial DNA profile being extracted from his trousers in 1996. This was then matched to Brian Field after his arrest. After this match was made, the police carried out surveillance on Field, and in 2001 he was arrested for his murder. He confessed to murdering Roy and was sentenced to life in prison. Field's conviction became of interest to police when they discovered that he had actually been arrested in Chelmsley Wood, where Patrick and David were living, and had disappeared. Police found out that in 1996, Field was actually living in the area and working as an odd job man and landscape gardener in the local neighbourhood. His background was also alarming, as he had been convicted for several offences involving teenage boys. He was arrested on charges of indecently assaulting a child in 1972, gross indecency in 1982, and for falsely imprisoning 2 teenagers aged 13 and 16 in 1986. Despite these convictions, he had not been on the police's radar during the 1996 and 97 investigations. The police did go and speak to Brian Field in relation to Patrick and David's disappearances. However, he denied any involvement in it. He continued to reject any involvement in the disappearances, but despite this, he was named a suspect by the West Midlands police, based on the information that they already knew. It's reported in a BBC article that the boys' case was reviewed in 2006, and that officers conducted a search of an area on Old Damson Lane near Solihull, which they knew that Field had previously used to dump rubbish and waste. They didn't find anything, and the search yielded no new clues. The police could not obtain any more information from the suspect himself, and without new evidence there was not much more that could be done. West Midlands Police stated that Field was only one of their lines of inquiry, and that they were pursuing other leads. The Shropshire Star newspaper reported in 2016 that a 37-year-old man was arrested and questioned when the case was reopened. There is no more information about this arrest, and he was released shortly after with no charges. West Midlands Police have stated that Brian Field remains a person of interest. Over the years, there have been several criticisms of West Midlands Police for the way that they dealt with the investigation, and specifically the length of time that it was treated as a missing person case rather than a murder inquiry. The fact that words like runaway and streetwise were used to describe the boys in the weeks and months after their disappearances has been cited as a reason why more information was not found earlier on. The boys' backgrounds were brought up regularly by police and in the media, and Professor David Wilson, a criminologist, is one of the people who believe that this coloured the way that people saw the case. He told the BBC in 2016, "They were made out to be much more adult. There was a great deal of attention on describing them as not being good at school, one of them chain smoking. There was the sense that they weren't really children, when in fact they were. Culturally, how you approach the first 48 hours in this type of case is either with urgency, or they'll turn up because they're runaways. If it had been 2 boys from middle-class Solihull who had gone missing, that case would have been treated very differently. It's about that word that we're never allowed to use, class. This was about a class judgment that was made which was prepared to see them as runaways, as opposed to vulnerable." It's reported that several days after the boys went missing, a 17-year-old girl called Nicola Dixon was found murdered in a graveyard in Sutton Coldfield, just 7 miles from Chelmsley Wood. The way in which her case was covered is often compared to the disappearances of Patrick and David, as her case used many of the police resources and was reported on nationwide. This was the correct response in Nicola's case. However, the stark difference in response in comparison with the boys' disappearances is hard to ignore. The families of the boys have not wanted to be in the limelight, and understandably have a distrust of speaking to newspapers about the boys' disappearances. It is clear that they believe more could have been done to help find their children. In 2016, the BBC went to try and speak to both families about the boys. They still live in Chelmsley Wood in the houses that they lived in 1996. David's mum, Christine, said in response to the journalists asking to speak to her, "What's the point? Nothing good ever came of it." Patrick's mum, Bridget, said she was not interested and told her son Derek not to speak to them. It's reported that before Derek shut the door, he said it was a fucking joke. It's clear that there is a lack of trust on the family's parts in relation to the case, and that the lack of progress over the years has not filled them with any confidence that their children will be found. David's brother Lee has, however, spoken to the media about his brother. 20 years after their disappearances, there was a media push to try and once again appeal for any witnesses or anyone with information. Lee spoke to the media about his brother in the hope that it would help to find him. He was very emotional when speaking about David, stating, "I've come to terms with the fact that David is dead, but I wake up every night wondering what happened to him and how he died. I just want to find him so that he can be laid to rest and we can have somewhere to go and visit him." He also gave permission for a video of David boxing to be released, hoping it might jog someone's memory of him. It's clear that what happened to his brother plays on Lee's mind, and that is with him every day. In response to the criticisms made, Detective Chief Inspector Caroline Marsh, who is currently in charge of the case, stated in 2016 that the delay in looking for the boys was due to them telling their parents the same story, that they were staying out for the night. She stated, "When they didn't come home and when they weren't immediately located, that was the story that was recounted. They were having some fun. The view was that they were just being boys. It took several days and weeks before the realisation settled that something was really wrong and they weren't coming back. If that happened this Boxing Day, I can guarantee that the response would be very different. The way we deal with missing person reports today is very different." When asked if she believed that they were treated any differently because of their background, she said no, saying, "I don't believe so. After the realisation settled, there was a lot of concern for the boys. Over the course of the first year, the inquiry was taken very seriously. The term streetwise was a term that was used in the past to describe children who could look after themselves. Today, that's something that's seen as a vulnerability. A couple of boys disappearing together is highly unlikely. It suggests that there's been a serious incident or criminal act, which is why today the case sits with the homicide team. I think what happened is a reflection of how we dealt with missing person cases 20 years ago. We have moved on a lot." Patrick and David remain missing, and their cases now sit with the homicide team. It's clear that due to the amount of time that had elapsed since their disappearances, that they are now being treated as murder inquiries. The boys did not have the means to support themselves when they disappeared, and there have been no sightings of them since. Something did clearly happen to them in the early hours of that morning, and the fact that Patrick left his bike suggests that perhaps they didn't get very far. Had Patrick hidden the bike, or someone who did the boys some harm? The investigation was slow to get going, and this would not be the case today, as CID officers are involved in the case of a child missing from home within 24 hours, and the case is immediately investigated. This is good progress since 1996, however it does not help the families of Patrick and David, who are still wondering where their sons are. The case is so sad and tragic, and I really do hope the families can finally get answers. David was 13 years old when he went missing and would be 37 years old today. Patrick was just 11 when he disappeared and would be 35 today. If you know anything about the disappearances, please contact West Midlands Police on 101. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Thank you to everyone that continues to support the podcast, and thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you want to receive ad-free early access episodes, bonus episodes, shout-outs and stickers, the link is in the show notes. You can also help by simply reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, or by following us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. I also have a YouTube channel where I upload audio from the cases if you want to subscribe over there and have a listen. If you have any suggestions for cases, please send them in to me at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope everyone is keeping safe, and I'll be back with you next week. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.